Welcome to MedAxiom HeartTalk, the podcast where cardiovascular thought leaders come together for one ultimate goal: to continually advance cardiovascular health care for all. MedAxiom HeartTalk starts now.
Good afternoon. I'm Joel Sauer with MedAxiom, and I'm joined this afternoon by Mike Middick, who is the founder and principal of Health Information Consulting.
That's right.
And we just got done with a very interesting, at least I thought it was a very interesting general session about the disruptive forces that are coming from not within, well, certainly within healthcare, but just as many that are coming from the outside world through technology companies like Apple, companies like United and Optum and Cigna, and then there's the CVS's, the Walgreens. I mean, it's just a never-ending barrage of disruptive forces.
Right.
In the final analysis, and I'm jumping ahead 20 years in the future, Mike, do you think, as a technology person yourself, is this good disruption for the industry?
Well, I think for an industry that was asleep for a long time, it is. And when I say asleep, I don't mean patient care-wise, because I think we've always been advancing patient care. Look at this space for cardiovascular medicine,
right,
which tends to be a pretty technical specialty. There's been tremendous advancements, certainly around imaging, around
I can get my valve done.
Yeah, exactly.
Through a
Minimally
catheter.
Invasive procedures. TAVR. Now the mitral valves.
Right.
The list goes on and on. But it operated in a kind of in a vacuum in a way, because it did a great job of having great technology for the service line, but it wasn't part of the bigger picture. And I think the disruption that we're now seeing really revolves around the access to data, because I don't think anyone can come into our industry with their eyes closed, and so they obviously have information that they feel they can make a difference in this industry, whether it's Google, Amazon, JP Morgan Chase, Berkshire Hathaway, CVS. They're already in the industry as a retailer. Their primary competitor, Walgreens, is in the industry. And I think what's happened, though, too, is that with the advent of information technology, specifically around electronic health records and the ability to move information getting better, that these organizations now feel like they can bring something to the table that maybe perhaps isn't here today, or they can do something better. I'm not sure what that all is, to be honest with you. But, one of the things that we look at is in disruption is what will it disrupt? What really will it change?
And who would be disrupted first?
Exactly, right.
Yeah.
And we tend to do things over and over again in our industry, just a little different, but nothing really changes in a major way. I think this time around, though, because of the buying power and the investment power of those companies that we just talked about, we're talking about a much different breed of animal here. And I mean that in a good way, because they have very deep pockets. They have a lot of employees. They have a lot of healthcare spend, and they're serious about trying to make a difference. Certainly, Walmart's not going to sit idly by to let Amazon take control of the supply chain.
Right.
They're not going to let that happen. They're going to jump into the fray. They already are jumping into the fray.
Yeah.
CVS buying Humana is going to obviously try to match up against Optum. And so Optum has a lot of the landscape covered. In our discussion earlier today, you pointed out all the acquisitions that Optum has
They have
made.
physicians, they have facilities,
Right.
They have pharmacy.
Unbelievable.
They have all of it,
Unbelievable.
except for that inpatient piece.
And for a long time, the stock market has valued Optum as the most valuable part of United. And now you got to take a step back and think, geez, if they thought it was valuable before, what's the value now? It's exponential in its explosion. So I think what's also disruptive is the traditional insurance companies, Anthem, Humana, Cigna, the Blues, they've kind of been forced now to go through a metamorphosis in changing of the guard themselves. simply because United has always had Optum, and now Optum is this huge important asset.
It became the dog instead of the tail.
Exactly. So, yeah, I think the disruption is going to be interesting. I think the large self-insured employers, as well as the companies that have the pockets to invest, like Berkshire Hathaway and Amazon and J.P. Morgan Chase,
We'll feel them.
We'll feel them for sure.
Do you think, the traditional health system of today, which is, the Ascensions, the HCAs, even the regional players that have multiple hospitals, they're not going to sit idly by and watch themselves get. So do you have any insight into what kind of strategic moves they'll make?
I think intuitively, if you look at the most successful health systems today and true health systems, those that have a geographic concentration of integrated delivery of care, most of the really successful ones also have a payer arm in their organization today. So that's Kaiser, Health Partners in Minneapolis, Geisinger, Marshfield.
What about Advocate and Aurora in your neck of the woods?
Advocate and Aurora, right. And so they have the horsepower. They're north of $10 billion in revenue, significant profit that can weather a storm if you take on risk. And I think the Ascensions, let's use Ascension as an example. St. Vincent's in Indianapolis has a huge concentration of,
27 hospitals.
Yeah, huge spread throughout the state. But you go to other Ascension markets, like in Nashville or other areas, Milwaukee, they have a lot of hospitals, but they're not integrated. There's no integration at all. So I think they have a much tougher road to go down in many markets where they're present. And I look at Ascension as a health system company. And just as we look at Dignity or CHI, Catholic Health Initiatives, those are hospital companies. But in their individual markets, do they have good health systems, largely integrated, where they have enough market coverage where they could be competitive, take risk, exactly. And I think the jury's still out on those organizations that are trying to get themselves in a position to be able to do that. The Advocates of the world and Aurora's, Health Partners, Allina, they all have a 10-year lead on them. And so they've learned a lot of lessons along the way.
So does that mean the Holy Grail is risk?
I think so. Or as my employer-based company, a client would say, a warranted outcome. They want people to take responsibility for a certain episode of care and make sure that, just like in Medicare, with the Medicare rules, if there's a 30-day readmission, that's on you. And so, as I think you pointed out in our discussion, where Medicare goes, the industry tends to follow.
They're such a big payer.
Exactly. Yeah. And they kind of can create rules that people take a look at and say, you know what? I like that 30-day admission rule. I think readmission rule. I think that makes sense for me too. Now, I'm a big employer. I'm not a Medicare, but I'm a big employer and I write big checks for $200 million in health care expense. I kind of like that rule. So I want to have that as part of my deal too. And so I think that's what we're starting to see, is that the employers, large self-insured employers that tend to lead the markets, they've already got on-site primary care. They can already set up wellness programs. They have nutritional coaches. They have health programs, wellness programs tied to their benefits, tied to deductibles, tied to copays. They're leading the charge here, trying to figure out what's the next step. Well, the next step is high-quality, warranted health care. And I think that's a valid ask of the industry.
Yeah. So a huge asset or necessity, I should say, in this clinical integration is interoperability of these disparate systems. Right. In your opinion, and you work in this industry and work on this issue, how many years in the future do you think we have to go before we have significant interoperability that functions?
Yeah, and when we say significant, it means so that we can move a patient's record from one organization to another and it's totally portable.
Right.
That's one thing. And then secondly is that we've got some discrete data that's really important, like medications and other data elements that are very important.
Those are important, huh?
They're all important. And I think 5 years is probably a realistic expectation. Now,
well, that's a short time. I thought you might say 10 or 15.
No, I think it's 5 now because of a couple things. One is
the law.
The law. It is the law. The Inspector General will come out with their ways as to how they're going to enforce it with both vendors and providers. I think the provider community that I'm most worried about is the independent physicians group. They're at the behest of their vendors, and if the vendors aren't compliant or that group doesn't keep up with the release cycle of that vendor software that makes them compliant, that could be problematic.
Or they can't afford to buy that upgrade. Yeah.
Right. And so that, I think I'm more concerned for that group. But I think because of the penalties, because of the pressure on the vendors, we've seen dramatic changes with Epic as an example. They used to be very problematic. They are challenging today, I will say that, I'll give them that, but they are very strict about how they want information to be moving in and out of their system. And they do it for a good reason, for quality of data. And
all it took is calling them in front of Congress, and they changed their ways.
It kind of did the trick, didn't it? Yeah,
it may.
It kind of did the trick. I think it worked well.
It has a tendency to do that.
Right. But we have to follow them very closely, and they started out with a couple of modules, Care Everywhere and Happy Together. Now we've got 12 sub-modules making up all of their interoperability solutions. So they are making great progress. But I think the forces of nature are finally taking hold here.
Okay, well, that's actually good news to end on, that we're within that 5-year horizon of having that kind of interoperability.
If not, the consumer is going to take control of it.
Oh, yeah, or if Apple or Google or somebody.
Somebody else will make it happen.
Yeah. I want to thank Mike Middick for joining me here for this HeartTalk, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Joel.
You've been listening to MedAxiom HeartTalk, the podcast where cardiovascular thought leaders come together to advance healthcare. You can follow MedAxiom on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. If you haven't yet, please be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next week for another MedAxiom HeartTalk, and thanks for listening.